Hello friends, I'm Kayla and it's time for the final episode in our series of books that made you feel something, where I asked you books that made you cry, books that made you laugh, books that made you shocked, books that made you scared, books that made you swoon. And finally, it's about books that made you smarter, books that made you learn something. Thank you to everybody who filled out the survey. I have loved going through all of these books and all of these experiences that you and I now share, and I'm ready to gain some knowledge. So here's the 78 books that were mentioned the most. I have read the least amount from this list of any list for any of these videos in this series. I think 12 or 13 books I have already read. And I typically really enjoy nonfiction, whether it's something that I went into it thinking I wanted to learn or not. And so I'm really excited to get into this list of books. I don't know what I'm going to be reading. I have a couple ideas and I have 7 days to read as many as I can. One that I'm really intrigued by is called Fearing the Black Body. I've read a lot of books about racial injustice, but I don't know that I've read a book quite like this that is talking about a specific element, fat phobia, how it has racist origins. I also 100% will be reading Forest Euphoria because this was voted on by my channel members to be our book club pick of the season, so there'll be a live show at the end of the week for this. It's about queerness in nature, and then I thought reading something about AI would be annoying but valuable. I have Being Mortal. I have The 100 Years War on Palestine. I've read a lot of books about Palestine. I have read the first, I think, half of it, and then I had to give it back to the library last year. So I don't know if I'll restart or what I'm gonna do with this. Then I have a couple other ones that I've been thinking about. A lot of these books I've never heard of before. Once I start reading one of them, then I will let you know about it. I started my first book, Fearing the Black Body. I wasn't thinking about how different making this vlog is gonna be because I can't, there's gonna be no moments where I can screenshot and put in the thumbnail of when I was shocked, when I was swooning, I could capture that. I'm not reading and going, oh my God, I just learned something crazy. And also I don't know how to do my scale because they were so easy. Was I swooning or was I not? I guess it's am I learning or am I not? But in every single case in all of these books, I'm going to be learning. So I guess if it's a mind-blowing fact versus I've heard all of this before, I don't know. Anyway, I read the first half of this physically, and then I went to the gym and I thought, while I'm at the gym, I'm just going to listen to the audiobook and I'm definitely going to retain all of the information. No, I missed photos. I missed just the ability to highlight things, and now I can't tell you what I learned from the last chunk. I remember a bunch of people being mentioned, of course. One of them was, oh God, see, now I don't remember her name. Sarah Hale, who originally wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. Never knew who wrote that, and sure, I could have Googled it if I ever thought I was interested, but I learned that via the text, and that tied into things because she was somebody who wrote a lot of information, like poems, songs, but also just articles that was in magazines back in the 40s, 50s maybe. Oh, see, this is exactly what I missed, and now I get to see it. Something that I am finding really interesting that the author hasn't been talking about, this is by Sabrina Strings, is how there are people so unqualified talking about things and teaching giant groups of people what they believe that they know with very limited information, and those people tend to be people who create art. So obviously nowadays it's just such a different process of teaching people things and becoming educated and having the ability to educate other people. But in a certain time period, it was just oh, I'm already prolifically known for my art, for my poetry, and now I'm just gonna write my opinions on diet and culture, and oh, I noticed that a lot of people when I was visiting this land look like this, and they tend to eat this way. So I started eating nothing but dairy all day. I'm on a completely milk diet, and I'm slim, so everyone else should have my diet too. And I actually think that's still such a thing, is influencers who gain a following in something completely unrelated, and then because they look a certain way, they're oh, let me take advantage of this and teach everybody else how to live like me. But they have no real background education rather than their own personal experience. And that has nothing to do with this book. She's not talking about that at all. It's just something that I've noticed. Obviously, we're talking a lot about art because that's just something that spans centuries, and we can easily look at depictions of people from history and think this is what people at this time period versus this time period thought was the standard of beauty. So I really like the intro in here. She was talking about a bunch of different books that are on similar topics but don't cover things exactly the way that she's doing it in here, why she wanted to write this book to begin with. And then we begin going through time and different time periods, how the slave trade impacted standards of beauty, how this person decided that people in a colder climate are naturally slimmer because they don't have the time and the abundancy of like sitting around in the heat and enjoying the fruits of the land. This person decided that because bile is a part of the body that like negatively impacts something in your stomach, like having too much bile, that's also what makes people's skin darker, and perhaps more time in the sun and more sitting around created more bile, which created more liquid fat. So many just like random theories. We're talking a lot about race, and we're talking a lot about bodies and completely unconnected things. And then we're bringing together kind of at the end of each section how it all works together and did in that time period or in that country or in that part of the world. A lot of this is actually more about men than women so far, and how women in a certain time period felt like they had a conservatorship over men, their husbands, and needed to ensure that they looked a certain way, and the indulgences of men needed to be regulated. I have finished my book. I have something in my eye. It's been in there for hours, and I cannot get it out. So I'm just gonna look like this. I think the portion that was about sugar was really interesting. Like the trade of sugar, the development of sugar, how people got access to it, how it became kind of a commodity. I would like a whole book on sugar the same way there's a book about salt. A bunch of people have been talking about this book about salt lately that I read a couple years ago. It's like a phenomenon, like everyone's reading it right now, which I think is really interesting, and I wonder why. Can someone tell me why it's like a thing that everyone's talking about? I also thought it was really interesting when it was talking about like stupidity being associated with fatness, which of course is something like constantly, currently still perpetuated, that if you're fat, you're stupid, that only like thin people are taken seriously in a lot of business senses. Something that I've learned about myself with nonfiction is I like ones that mix history with opinion or analysis, like not just talking about things that have happened, but how it also still affects us today, or just more personal thoughts from this author. Because just like I read this sports nonfiction recently, that the best part about it was the little epilogue, the only part of the book that gave any opinion. This one also had an epilogue that gave actual thoughts from the author, but it was only like 5 pages, and it was really strong, and I would have liked more opinion, but I understand that that's not what the intent of this was. On my scale, I learned enough things, but it was also a lot of things that I've heard before. So this book taught us about the invention of BMI and how it's like who it kind of left out along the way and how it's bias. And then it talked about, that Kellogg cereal guy and what he was doing with his cereal and in masturbation stuff. Things that I've certainly learned before, and I think she probably learned and was like, oh, that's a really interesting fact, let me throw that into this book, when there was probably like 20 or 30 other people she could have pulled from and given like other random similar facts, but that was the most interesting because everyone's kind of already been talking about it. My final rating is a 4. I think this was well written, definitely read like a textbook. Would I recommend it? Yes, but also alongside a couple books. I think it should be paired with something with some analysis. There was the impact of fat phobia on medicine, and I just think that there could be more about that and like the implications current day. And I also think you should read this alongside From Margin to Center. There was this little moment where I thought it was coming full circle, and it was saying like why so many white women are so obsessed with the bodies of others, but she didn't really get to the root of that, I think, how white women were perceived and how they felt like they needed and why they needed to distance themselves from another group. And with a book like that, it would give more language, evidence for why you should be centering women of color. Intersectional feminism is so important. How it does have positive effects for everybody. Glad I read it. Thank you to everybody who mentioned it. For maybe by being an A student, baby. Oh my God, I had the worst sleep last night. Like, literally terrible. I was having so many dreams. And it's funny because I was complaining the last couple nights that I've been having the most boring dreams and they've been lasting all night. I was telling Rob about it. I was like, literally the other night, I had to sort marbles in my dreams into different colors. And I swear it was all night. It was my whole 7 hours of sleep. I was in this one dream sorting these fucking marbles. And then I had another dream the next night that was so boring. I woke up and I was like, oh my God, like I'm exhausted. It was so dull and I'm used to really exciting, intriguing dreams. And then so last night, I kept having dream after dream after dream that was so crazy that I was waking up. Well, I don't know if that's why I was waking up. Actually, I didn't feel very well last night, so it was probably because of the dinner and I had to pee a lot for some reason. Anyway, I got a really bad sleep because I went to bed at midnight and then I woke up at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 3 o'clock after these crazy dreams. And I kept wanting to get back to them. And I remember actively thinking like, okay, let me get back to that really good dream. And then I didn't. And it was just, they just kept getting wilder and wilder. In one of them, I had my shoes, it was like they were wrapped. I was walking around someone's house. I do remember who it was. I was like hanging out with a group of YouTubers and I was in a house with them. I had bought a house with one of them and I had to wear plastic on my feet everywhere that I walked, but nobody else did. And then I just started like fighting with people about it. Anyway, it made me think today, like I kind of wish that one of the nonfictions I was reading was Why We Sleep, because that was the most intriguing to me when I looked at the spreadsheet. And then when I went to pick it, because I was gonna give that as an option for one of the book club picks for me and all my members to read, some people informed me that that book has been like debunked, like disproven. A lot of the facts in it were just made up and they've been proven wrong. And that was really disappointing because I wanted to read that and I wanted to learn about why we sleep. But I could probably come up with a lot of fake ideas that were just as interesting as the book. Anyway, what I'm actually reading is What My Bones Know. And you should be proud of me. Even though I had a terrible sleep, I still went to the gym first thing in the morning like I have for the last month, almost successfully every single day. And this was much more conducive to that gym experience than yesterday's book was. This is more of a narrative nonfiction. Because it's a memoir, it is her life and she's telling us experiences that she's had. So last night I read the first, I tapped it so I could tell you, the first 100 pages. And then this morning at the gym, I listened to the next big chunk. And the first half, definitely better to read physically because I needed to take breaks. It was her talking about her upbringing and the trauma that she experienced, the abuse, the constant abuse that she went through as a young child. It's called A Memoir of Healing from Complex Trauma. So there's this CPTSD that is lesser understood than PTSD, that has more stigma around it, that is just less explored. And it comes from repeated exposure to trauma as an adolescent. And she's talking about exactly what she went through. She gives the perfect warning at the beginning and it was tough. It was really tough to read. And then right after that, it got into a bunch of stuff that I highlighted because I learned so much about how the brain physically changes. Brain scans prove that patients who sustain significant childhood trauma have brains that look different from those people who haven't. Traumatized brains tend to have an enlarged amygdala, a part of the brain that is generally associated with producing feelings of fear. For survivors of emotional abuse, the part of their brain that is associated with self-awareness and self-evaluation is shrunken and thin. Women who've suffered childhood sexual abuse have smaller somatosensory cortices. See, I should have been listening to the audiobook for this because I would have learned how to pronounce these things. There's a bunch of other stuff. Childhood abuse is often associated with reduced thickness in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain associated with moderation, decision-making, complex thought, and logical reasoning. And a lot of trauma affects like the body. I know that there was a video I made a long time ago where I said something about physical illness and then I talked about mental illness, and a couple of people commented and they were like, you shouldn't actually distinguish those two because mental illness is a physical illness in itself. And the thing with complex PTSD is it often affects like a lot of things throughout your entire life, not just how you emotionally respond to things. But she's gone through many medical ailments that she shares throughout these pages, and how it might be connected to her childhood trauma, and how she has to go to all of these different therapists and psychologists and go through so many different medical situations in order to get somebody to listen to her, to get somebody who's educated in the right thing. And there was this whole section that I really appreciated her including that talked about that kind of journey of finding a therapist. Especially finding a licensed clinical psychologist with an open slot is really difficult. And then also she's a woman of color, and a lot of people in the profession tend to be white people, which just doesn't, give her as close of a connection as, or somebody who might understand her quite as well. You need to receive an official diagnosis for your insurance, but then if your mental disorder isn't listed in the DSM and CPTSD isn't in the DSM, psychologists haven't been trained in treating it. So it's like when you go to one therapist, they're trying to treat you for something else that they are more like adept at handling. And then apparently psychiatrists are the least likely of any medical provider to take insurance. Only about 45% of them do. Insurance companies haven't updated reimbursement rates for therapists in up to 20 years, which is so crazy. But like obviously there's so much wrong in the medical community, like you can't know every little intricacy of who's being underpaid or who's being underinsured or like how everything is working unless you're like in it. I'm definitely learning things, but that is, I would say, not even 10%, maybe 5% of the book. There's little stats like that, and they're perfectly placed. She's going through her life and experiences that she's had and how her childhood trauma has informed the way that she moves about in the world, jobs, relationships, etc. Maybe every couple chapters she will share a couple pages of facts and things that she has learned and that has helped her or hindered her in her journey of like diagnosis and recovery and just like working through her trauma. And what the part that I was just listening to is she was meeting with a therapist, and he was recording their sessions, and she ended up putting what I'm pretty sure is that actual recording into the audiobook. So it's not super clear, but I think it's really valuable, and it kept me really engaged while I was at the gym, was listening to, it's just like one of the chapters in here, but actually hearing her and her therapist talk through some various things, it was really interesting. I would say what I'm learning most is just about her life, which is what you get from a memoir. I wouldn't say that there's an abundance of knowledge that I'm gaining from this. And I think the number one reason somebody would be reading it is if they can relate, because obviously a lot of people can't get the medical care that they need and don't understand their own, like what could have been a diagnosis if they went through the entire, like all the steps for it. So this could help them understand themselves better for sure, I think. And various coping mechanisms that she explores. I don't think I know anybody personally who this book would like help me get to know better, but I am learning about her. So I feel like it's pretty low down as far as the knowledge that nonfiction could offer, because this is more of a memoir, but I'm really glad that I ended up reading this second because it's so different than the last book that I read. You know, when the book started as difficult as it did, I should have probably expected it to make me cry at one point, but I didn't anticipate that. I was tearing up near the end of this book. She was talking about like how like her parents' reactions versus how she would react if she had children, and like how she would treat her own children, and kind of speaking to her child self. That was really sad. I really like this book. It is a memoir, so I'm not technically rating it. Meanwhile, the rest of the nonfiction, of course, will be rated. I learned a couple of things as far as like different kind of medical trials revolving around mice. Nothing that was really shocking or something I couldn't have assumed had been tested. But there was also this talk about experiencing trauma at different points in your cycle and how that can affect you differently. That was weird and interesting. As far as pairings for this one, I would say The Body Keeps Score, but not with the controversy surrounding it. She read a book in here that I've also read called How to Do Nothing. I don't know if I would recommend it, but it was interesting that she mentioned something that I've read. I don't think I really have. Oh, actually, I've seen a bunch of my Goodreads friends read this book called something like Adult Children of Immature parents or something, so maybe that would be valuable. Let me look if there's anything else on this shelf that I could pull. Maybe it's been a long time since I've read this, but don't call me crazy, just because it talks all about mental health and different people's experiences and just like so many different topics, and it's kind of enjoyable to look at. Maybe there's something with How to Say Babylon that I would connect and recommend. This is about being raised with violence, but with a lot more religious stuff involved. Am I glad I read it? Yes. Would I recommend it? Yes. In both cases, even though I don't personally connect with much of anything that she was talking about, I didn't gain anything in that way. If you're also thinking something similarly, I would still pretty broadly recommend this one. Really well written. Hello. I have 2 library books that I'm reading at the same time. One is Codependent and one is Wordslut. Now, I started Wordslut and I instantly, very first page, wanted to highlight stuff. So I kept reading the first chapter and I wanted to highlight everything. So then I moved over to Codependent and I got 1 chapter into that too. And that's fine reading as a library book, but I'm going to go out and purchase myself a physical copy of Wordslut because it's good. It has been a long day. Hello. I've read some things. I bought Liam all new hockey gear every single year. The same thing happens where we buy all this stuff like elbow pads and chest protector and shin guards and the skates and the helmet and the neck guard. And every single time we're like, this one's gonna last a couple seasons. And it never does. Like we bought all this stuff just last year and then I bought it all over again. So that's what I spent my morning doing. I ended up at the mall for a bit. I got some new jeans. Look at these ones. They're like embroidered. So cute. And then these ones that are just like, I don't know, normal denim. I also got this new lip color that I really like. Dewy Peach. I'm forever angry at all of these companies who don't make peach colored things anymore. Like there's genuinely no peach lip liner at the drugstore. They either have a really warm brown or they have like a bright orange. But I feel like this peach is kind of nice. I also just went to the gym, so I'm not looking my best. Oh, and most importantly, I grabbed the book. So this is what I'm reading. This is also what I'm reading. Now, Codependent is Living in the Shadow of AI is the subtitle. This is by Madhumita Murgia. And it is about AI for sure. I feel like a companion for this, not that I've read it, would be that one that's specifically about like, what is it called? Open AI? That really delves deep into a specific company and what that specific company is doing. This is more a look at, it is AI, but tech and how tech impacts people, how tech takes advantage of marginalized communities, how tech doesn't prioritize them. And we're constantly, yes, talking about AI. It's divided up really interestingly into sections that don't really feel like that's what they need to be called. But I understand, you know, it needed to be organized in some way. So like chapter 1 is called Your Livelihood. There's one that's Your Future. There's one that's Your Safety, Your Freedom, Your Health, Your Identity, Your Body. And it sounds like the kind of book, I'm loving this by the way. I think this could be a 5-star. It's between a 4 and a 5 probably. But looking at those chapter titles, sounds like it's probably specifically talking about you and like the world as a whole and like how AI is affecting our bodies, affecting our livelihood. I wouldn't say that's really what she's talking about. What she's doing is giving us a narrative style. Each chapter we're following a specific person, a specific concept. It starts out with a person. So like in one of them, we met somebody living in Nairobi who was doing, hold on, I took notes. Oh yeah, he was labeling video elements. So his whole time at work was spent watching videos of like cars driving around. And he was typing or writing down everything that he could see on the video to help train self-driving cars. So we were talking about his livelihood. That's something that he was doing for work. And a lot of people's livelihood and how people are hired to do these jobs, and they're often people living in poverty, or they're people who are refugees. They're people who don't have a lot of other options for work, and they're being taken advantage of. For one, I'd never thought about the thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are essential for this machine learning to even function, because for AI to learn something, people have to be inputting the information. So, and even to ban certain things from AI, somebody has to train AI for what to look out for and what to stop it from creating. So these people are being forced to, they're participating, but obviously when you're offered this kind of opportunity and you're someone otherwise living in poverty, you're disenfranchised youth, etc., you take this job and you don't even know, they're it's shown that they're not even really told what they're participating in, and they're not really given an idea of the morals and ethics of what they're doing. And they also aren't even really told that they're essentially training something that will then replace them and what their job is. But they have to watch violence. They have to watch dismembered bodies. They have to watch child sexual abuse, assault materials, which the book does refer to as child porn, which really pisses me off. I don't know why books are still doing that these days. They have to teach the machine how to recognize that, and therefore they have to consume it and explain it in great detail to these machines. And there was a lot of powerlessness discussed in that chapter, and then in another one where somebody was working for Uber, and it was talking about how that whole thing, the hiring process, the firing process, the sending people to various places, how it actually functions is all controlled at this point by AI. And therefore there is no typical job steps when there is something wrong, or there's a bug, or you are getting in trouble for something. There's no one for those workers to go to. And again, these types of jobs are typically taken by people who don't have other options, or who are desperate for that paycheck, and they don't have enough incentive. They don't have enough time. They're not being compensated if they decide to take an issue and highlight it for their boss, because they don't even know who that is, or to fill out these request forms for things to get changed within the app, because they never change them anyway. Nobody seems to really care when there are errors within these delivery services. And how, as an employee in any step of the AI business world, you've a very powerless cog in the machine. It's very well written. It's very well written, clearly well researched. The people she's talking to, the people that she chooses to highlight. I really like how this is written. It's definitely not what I expected it to be. I thought it was going to be a more broad look at AI and how it's affecting all of us, but it's more case by case, just human stories to help you connect to people and understand the help and harm of AI that's all happening at the same time. But now I'm going to switch over, before I finish that, to wordslut, because I really want to get back to this. One of the first things that was talked about in here, so this author is a writer and reporter from Baltimore. She's just a really fun narrator of this. She clearly cares a lot about language and wants to correct people, wants people to be having the right language, wants to talk about feminism within language, how we can reclaim certain words, and how, of course, we all recognize that there are so many more feminine words used as insults than masculine words, right? Obviously, you call someone a pussy, you call someone a sissy, which originates with sis, sister. Buddy and sissy originally were abbreviations of the words brother and sister, and only sissy is used as an insult, right? But also things that aren't specifically insults, but just words that have a more negative connotation than they originally had, and it's only the female version. So I loved this opening section where she was talking about a lot of pairings of words. Sissy and buddy, but we also had sir and madam. 300 years ago, those were both formal addresses for a man and a woman. Madam evolved to mean a conceited or precocious girl, then a kept mistress or prostitute, and finally a woman who manages a brothel. All of that excitement, while the meaning of sir just stuck where it was. Same with master and mistress. Those were originally used at the same time to indicate somebody with authority, and now one has become representing of somebody who's sexually promiscuous, and one it just describes a dude who's in charge of stuff. I already love what she's talking about. She has referenced AAVE multiple times, because I think that's a really important part of this if so much of it is going to be about like slang. And I just love how she kicked off this whole thing talking about insults and talking about swear words. I know it's called wordslut, so you can expect that, but I think that was like the necessary way to kick off this book. And I'm sure we're gonna go down plenty of other paths. So I'm gonna grab my highlighter and I'm gonna go to town on this book for the next couple hours because I'm really interested in this. I finished Wordslut. I almost finished Codependence. I have one section left. My review of this. Okay. My rating of this is a 4.25. I learned a lot of things about the origin of language. That was pretty much all my takeaways were, but it covered a lot more than that. And in fact, I think to its own detriment for a couple of the sections, it kind of just went off on a tangent that she just wanted to have, and it was a good one. She was talking about respect for people. She was talking about abuse and assault and like catcalling for women. And there was some language like in some of these conversations, but there was a lot of moments where she was just like off talking about something really random. Not that it was bad, but maybe could have been its own book. Another thing I didn't love about it was there was a couple moments where she said like, there's been, or all the studies show, and then a fact, or there was this study that showed this. And there was probably only 4 different moments in the book where that happened, but it was moments that felt really interesting because why would you not share the specific source for that one specific thing that you're trying to hammer home when there's so many references? I saw in a bunch of people's reviews, like more than you'd expect, a complaint for a lack of sources listed at the end. And that's not something I've ever really thought to notice, is if they have pages and pages at the end of sources, because a lot of times the author will mention like the book and the study and whatever within the pages. So like sometimes, obviously I notice when it's there and it takes up like 100 pages and I'm like, holy shit. But I don't think I've ever really noticed when it's not there. And apparently that's something that bothers a lot of people, but she referenced so many books. Like I can show you all the books that she was talking about. I can show you a whole bunch of studies she was talking about because I was looking them up. I was interested in them. And then I saw a bunch of people mention that she didn't cite her sources. And I wonder if it's like just a couple times that I noticed, or if they mean the whole, like a whole list at the end. But like she does mention where she's getting all of these things. And I think where this author shines, Amanda Montell, did I tell you what this is called? A Feminist Guide to Taking Back the English Language. That's the overall theme, but we are doing a lot of other things. She shines collecting data and explaining it and quoting other people and interrogating what they mean by what they said. I think when she is sharing her own opinion about things, it's not really clear where she's going with a certain topic, and I feel like she doesn't know how to end it. It reminded me a little bit of reading Feminist Fight Club, I think it was called. I remember liking that. I think I gave it 4 stars, which I was surprised by because it had, similar to this, like some millennial humor and stuff, a lot of maybe pop culture references. It was a long time ago that I read that. And I think this is best for like the liberal feminist girl boss kind of girl who has the same humor as the author or has the same kind of reference point. I liked the section that was talking about women throughout time and their voice. She was talking about how people perceive women's voices as being shrill and how you'd never describe a man a certain way. How when it comes to all of the justices, there's statistics on which ones get interrupted the most, and it's women. She will say a lot of things that feel like generalizations, but she'll follow it up by saying, this is a generalization. So at least that's fair. I liked a lot of this. I'm really glad I read it. I would recommend it. I have finished Codependence and I'm giving it a 4. I feel like this was a really good book for what it is and what I wanted to talk about. I learned things. I enjoyed the process of reading it. The ending talked a lot about people who have allegedly died due to AI and tech, and human rights issues was talked about a lot in here. There was a human rights advocate who she was talking to. There was a lot about surveillance technology, and I really liked in the epilogue that the author posed a bunch of questions. There's a list of 10 questions to think about when you're engaging with AI, or what the world should look like with AI. Like, what would a fairer and more consistent global wage for AI data workers look like, one that reflects the growing lucrative market for their services, because it's not going to just pretend that we can all collectively shut down AI like tomorrow. It wasn't like the most engaging thing that I've ever read, so that's just why I'm sticking with a 4. I feel like I give a lot of nonfiction a 4. Glad I read it and would recommend. At this point, I have already completed the entirety of Forest Euphoria because this was a book club pick. As I was reading it, I was having a really hard time trying to figure out what the discussion should be with my book club, how to pose questions, like what I would want to talk about. So I was just kind of tabbing anytime I had a thought, but a lot of those thoughts were, why are we talking about this right now? What does this have to do with anything? Can we get back to the topic we were on? So I didn't like this. But the thing about this is I don't disagree with a single thing that was talked about in here. This is the abounding queerness of nature. That should not be the subtitle. This author wrote a memoir. This is a memoir. I'm not going to rate it because I don't rate memoirs. So that feels good that I don't have to assign a number to this because it is about somebody's life. While it is about somebody's life, I just feel like it's talking about too many things at once. It's very unclear. It's very disorganized. It's very chaotic. There are sections called different things like slugs, snails, and other ways of being. And we start to talk about slugs and we get the mention of slugs and the way that they mate and how it's not heteronormative. And that's what I expected this book to be entirely. And then we're talking about an ostrich for a paragraph and not really learning that much, but just like, oh, there's this ostrich that has this thing. People don't really know how to classify it. And then we move on to a discussion about Trump. And then we move on to a discussion about the genocide in Armenia. And then we move on to talk about research funding. And then suddenly we're talking about a flower. And then we're talking about a beetle. And then we're talking about her time in first grade where she learned something. And then we're talking about the importance of queer community. And like everything makes sense. I love that in every chapter. No, I don't love in every chapter that we're talking about the same things. I love that we're talking about many things, like the importance of nature and connecting with nature and giving historical facts about colonization and sharing the murder of all of these animals and how it affected the population that was already there and how people are trying to move people out of different places and how they're building structures in swamplands and the importance of all of these creatures and the importance of queer community. And like, there's so many topics and I like all of the topics, but it's so incredibly disorganized that I don't know why we're talking about what when. There's this entire section about William Shatner's trip to space. He's not queer that I know of. And also space has nothing to do with the queerness of nature, but she is tying in conversations and like you could after the fact think, okay, maybe she's talking about this because we as people are so focused on going to space and not the land that we live on. Sure, but that's just not what I thought we were reading about. And even if I learned that's not what we're reading about and this is more of a memoir, I just don't like how it was written. It feels like she wanted to have a lot of conversations that are very important and thoughtful, like Armenia, where her family is from, and like a tradition she wanted to talk about. But in order to get there and to get to what I think she wanted to talk about to begin with, she had to come up with some kind of conversation about something. There was like a flower. We were learning about this flower that doesn't subscribe to traditional reproductive situations. And then because that flower kind of looks like another flower completely unrelated but is representative of Armenia, then we start talking about Armenia. And then in another section she was talking about eels, these magnetic eels that have so much iron in their body that it makes them magnetic. Like, that's super interesting. It didn't have too much to do with queerness, but then it talked about salmon also have a little bit of metal in their forehead. And that reminds her of this Armenian word that means writing on the forehead. And then it got into a conversation again about Armenia and traditions. And there was one where she's talking about the Gaelic language and it was related to something. I just don't know that the theme of this is really the theme of this. There was this whole section about crows and then tied it to queer community and how crows are foragers and have to make their own communities. Queer people often have to do that as well. But like, I feel like you could have tied that to any animal and there was nothing about queerness within that animal, except there was one line in the entire like 30 pages that said, some studies show that crows can be queer. So I just don't know that every chapter or even every paragraph had a real intent behind it. We just went on tangent after tangent. And even if I agree with every single thing this author said, the way that it was presented to me was not an enjoyable experience. And it was also one of those books that oftentimes with her talk about like psychedelic mushrooms and time in the forest where you have to find like a sit spot where you can just like be one with the earth and like hear and think and like appreciate the animals, and these sounds that people might find annoying, they're actually like the beautiful songs of sex in nature. And it was just a little too like, oh, connect with the earth. You have to connect with the earth. And like, I'm already connected with the earth, but not in the like mystical kind of way that she was talking about. One of her now husband, when they met, came to her apartment and saw what she was into, asked her if she was a witch, and there was a whole conversation about that. I feel like I would recommend, if a good pairing for this might be like White Magic. I equally didn't enjoy that, but I feel like the writing style is kind of similar. I would say if you went into this thinking it was going to be more about like the creatures and recognizing things in nature, I really liked the one that was about 7 sea creatures. That one was also a memoir, but it felt a lot more organized and structured. And then there was this one that people were recommending in their Goodreads review, saying this one, I think it was called Bitch something. That one actually gave them what they were looking for from this. I just feel like this was mismarketed for sure. I feel like after it was written, they were like, we have to find a way to tie all this together. Let's call it Abounding Queerness in Nature. But that wasn't really what the theme was for me. There was this whole section talking about the swamp and decided that we as people are swamp things. And like, I get the biodiversity and the things that are tied together. I just don't really buy it all. This was very much about her life and her experience, difficult things, assaults that she went through, and her own gender dysphoria and her going through school. And I feel like we learned a lot about how she learned about science rather than delivering us what she learned from science. There were a couple people at the book club who absolutely loved this and got a lot out of it. For the most of us, it just wasn't what we were expecting. But even though I can adapt, and what it actually was is something that I could have enjoyed if it was written and structured differently. I would say there was maybe 3 facts in here that I learned that I thought were interesting. One was about slugs and how they pile up and they become the sex that they are based on who they're next to in the pile and their position. And then the magnetic eels was interesting. But unfortunately, each of those learnings really was just essentially a bullet point. We didn't go much deeper with any of those because we were talking about so many other things. I learned about the author, I suppose, but as far as facts about the world, in a 218 page book, for like 2 of the pages to be scientific learnings, I'm gonna say this was kind of a flop in that regard. Oh, and as far as telling you if it's more textbook, more narrative, it's surprisingly more textbook, even though it turns out to be a memoir, which is just a very odd experience. Today, I am going to read The 100 Years' War on Palestine. So I started this a couple years ago. A lot of people were borrowing this. A lot of people were talking about Palestine. I think this came out in 2021. And since I've read a lot of, not a lot, like a handful of books about Palestine and Canada's relationship with Palestine, various countries' dynamics, and the ones that kind of built upon the history but weren't the history of Palestine, and ones that I think that other people would say were disappointing to them because they weren't what they expected from the book when they were looking for a history of Palestine. And this is like what they need to be checking out. So I've recommended this a lot, even though I never finished it because I had to give it back to the library. So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna grab the audiobook and kind of re-listen to the first half. I feel like it was halfway through that I got to. And it gave me a really good understanding, I think, up until the 1980s. And then I'm probably going to start physically reading from there on. What I remember, what I gleaned the first time, and what I've taken into my other like continuations of learning, I would say this is already going to be pretty top of the thermometer for learning. And then it's not the kind of thing that I can tell you about after the fact, like everything that I learned when there was only 3 things in here and it was pretty easy to go through those. This is a very deep, sorted history with many moving parts and groups of people and dynamics. But at least by the end, I will have a rating for you and maybe something useful to say. I would not recommend reading this in its entirety over a 24-hour period, but that is what I decided to do for this week in my life in this video. Top of the list, just as I thought, for education, I learned a lot of things. I do, of course, wish that this covered the last couple years, but there are definitely other books that would be really valuable to pair with this one. There's one specifically, but if you live in Canada and you want to know Canada's relationship with Palestine, I think there's another one that's also really useful. Something that I was really thinking about while reading this, the book wasn't specifically saying to me, but with all of the evidence of the Zionist movement and British imperialism and just active campaigns to remove all Palestinian people from the land, there's this lack of education or intentional propaganda for people, like the powers that be, especially in Western countries, that believe their citizens to be so easily misled and cannot think for themselves. I think there's just this understanding that people will say, you know, like the people who don't want you to really understand what's going on, don't want you to read books like this. They'll say, oh, it was an, like, you know, it was an accident, or like it just happened over time and it's just this conflict and both sides are so guilty and like we don't really want to get into it, and like it's something that's happening over there and we don't need to worry about it. We don't really have anything to do with it, and anything that did happen, it was just kind of accidental. I feel like in a certain world, in a certain time period, like that was a reasonable understanding, and because education and historical knowledge is a privilege, people really need to take that opportunity to teach themselves, because our education system isn't necessarily going to do that for us. And there are so many reasons why, and reasons why the powers of the country want you to remain uninformed. They want you to be stupid. They don't want you to question the things that maybe benefit certain people and not other people. They don't want you to call it a genocide. They don't want you to think it's intentional. They don't want you to think they have anything to do with it. They don't think that you should really understand how your tax dollars are working and how it is causing death. And it's just every piece of information in here, the things that people signed and the things that people agreed to and the quotes from people in history. It's just impossible to ignore how everything is so intentional and how we are complicit in horrific things that are being done. And it's not as dry as you think it's going to be. Sure, it's textbooky, but I think I wouldn't call this narrative nonfiction, but it is very inviting in my opinion, especially because this man, Rashid Khalidi, is talking about his identity and his family and people that he has learned from and things that he has seen. And it was just really well put together. I don't really know what to rate it, just because when I give a nonfiction 5 stars, it's because it usually did something like really interesting, or it taught me in a really unique way, or I was impressed by something specific. It's not usually about like the emotional impact or the knowledge impact. It's like something extra. So I think I am going to give this a 4-star, like I've given most all books in this video. Teacher, can you teach me? We're on to the final book. You just saw what it was. That's what I selected. I know for a fact that there are so many books on this list that I would learn things from and that I would be happy to read. But at this point, it's not that I want to read something fun. Maybe I want to read something more engaging, more hopeful. There's just a lot of things that I don't feel like reading right now. I don't in this moment want to read more about the natural world. I don't want to read about our relationship with land. I don't want to read about sex and gender. I don't want to read about technology and AI. I don't want to read about the solar system. I don't want to read about big pharma. I don't want to read about racism and sexism and the prison industrial complex. I don't want to read true crime right now. I don't want to read self-help right now. I don't want to read about cannibalism. I don't want to read about cults. And a lot of the books that intrigue me on the list, I have read from those authors before. I'm sure they'd be good. They're just not calling to me. There's really only two things that I've been thinking about. One is Stephen King's On Writing, but I just read something related to him, so that doesn't pique my interest, but that's something kind of outside of the rest of the list. And then the Anthropocene Reviewed. Or the tuberculosis one. I imagine they're kind of similar as far as what we're talking about, because John Green has passions for so many different things. And I think much like Forest Euphoria, the Anthropocene Reviewed, and maybe tuberculosis, but I'm not totally sure, is covering a lot of different topics all at once. This one I remember people talking about years ago, that it was just really interesting because each chapter is so short and it talks about something super random that he's just passionate about. And so you can learn, but also I think for most people it's getting to know John Green better, and that's something they really enjoy. I have read some of his books. I've watched some of his videos. I'm not somebody who follows the Green brothers really closely. So I'm sure what other people really get out of this book is more about like their relationship with him. But I'm interested to see if all the topics he's going to cover and review, I guess each one is like, here's a concept, like, let me find a chapter. Dr. Pepper, learning how Dr. Pepper got invented, and then he ranks it at the end, like 4 out of 5 stars or whatever. I just think that sounds like kind of a fun read. I don't have a physical copy, so it's gonna be the audiobook. I know he narrates it, so I think it'll be engaging and interesting. I never really planned to read any of John Green's nonfiction, but it was mentioned the most, I think, of anything that people submitted, so it just feels like the right way to end the week. I had no way of knowing how spot on my comparison to Forest Euphoria would be when starting this. We're talking about so many topics at once, just like that book, and even like similar topics at times, but it's just so well organized and it's so like short little moments, and I'm learning things that I didn't think I even cared about, and that's where nonfiction really works. And you know it's done well is when it's making you, that's just something about the writing style of it and his passion for things that makes you care. Like I just learned that I think the most amount of hot dogs anyone has ever eaten in a hot dog eating competition was 70 hot dogs. I couldn't have told you. I've never watched a hot dog eating contest. This seems like a very American experience. But if I had to guess beforehand how many hot dogs I thought the winner of one of those contests would have eaten, I would have said under 30. Like, I don't know. 70 just seems so crazy. What else did I learn? I learned about the origin of scratch and sniff stickers. I didn't know I wanted to know that. And he was talking about the power of senses and like smell and how it brings back childhood memories. And yesterday I was in an office building and I smelled something that was so familiar, and it just brought back all these memories from when I was 15 working in this hotel, and it smelled identical, and I don't know what the smell was, but I didn't know that I wanted to learn about scratch and sniff stickers. There was Dr. Pepper. We also got a review for a book in here, and I kind of wish there was more of those because it was about The Great Gatsby. And I don't really know anything about it besides just having read it myself and its popularity. But in its time, like with a lot of books, it wasn't really popular. But he talked about like why it gained popularity and also his thoughts on it. And I love reading other people's book reviews within books. So hopefully there's more of that. I learned about a monkey that's known to be able to whisper. That was really interesting. The very first one was about Halley's Comet and how long the Earth has been around and the entire life. If he placed the entire lifetime of the planet within, like as if it was a calendar year, and was talking about how human existence has will have only existed for like December 31st of an entire calendar year. That's how long the planet has been around. But then we also learned about like the origin of the name and the person who discovered Halley's Comet and how that guy wrote his name differently every time. And John's just appreciation and like awe of humans' perseverance, and then a story of him and his dad going to like a cabin and building a bench, and how all of the scientific innovation was really essentially funded by slavery. again, so it's like talking about so many things at once, but everything makes sense and everything ties into the next thing. And then we're not going on tangents about all of these little facts and all of these little thoughts. It's kind of like he assumes that you are knowledgeable about all of these topics and you don't need to be spoon-fed the information, or you will go then to learn more of the information if you don't know what he's talking about. He just spends the right amount of time on each thing. And I can't imagine what this looks like physically, but sometimes it feels like these little vignettes, chapters, essays are like a page and a half long. I never really thought about the origin of grocery stores either. And I don't think I ever knew that originally when you went to the grocer was doing everything for you. Like they were going and picking everything out and packaging everything up and giving it to you. I'm sure I've seen that in movies or something, but it's never occurred to me that that was the origin of companies having to start to market to customers, was because the first, like Piggly Wiggly opened the first self-serve grocery store. When it began, I learned about that, and like people had to go shop for themselves, got to shop for themselves, how that started. And yeah, there's little things about him and little things about his view of the world and his personal struggles, but mostly I am learning a lot through the experiences and the things that he cares about and wanted to learn and then wanted to give to us. It's very interesting. Okay, final thoughts on the Anthropocene reviewed. Really enjoyed it. Thought it was good. Gonna give it 4 stars, much like almost every book in this video. I do think as the book went on, it was more for people who love John Green as a person, who know a lot about him and want little insights into his life, into like what he cares about and his relationships and his experience as an author and like his passion for writing and stuff like that. It also, I don't want to say devolved into, but really got focused on illness at the end. And something I didn't mention is he wrote this during COVID, the beginning days of COVID rather. And a lot of the things he was talking about were informed by his kind of existential thoughts and his interest in and fear of illness. And towards the end, it was a lot about tuberculosis. There was one about malaria. There was one about smallpox. And I think almost those should have been sprinkled throughout rather, because it started out kind of fun and random and then got a little more serious, I guess, which I guess is a good tone. But if I was reading this like a normal person probably would, where it was 1 or 2 essays a day over a long period of time, I think it would have started to feel, and it did feel a little bit monotonous at the end. But I can definitely see how this book would have spurred him on to write the one about tuberculosis. I learned about the origin of vaccines, which I already knew, but the origin of the word vaccine, which I didn't, so that was interesting. He talked about his love of the band The Mountain Goats, which I also love. There was a lot of stuff about art and how he sees his art, how he's had to see his art over time compared to other people, kind of like pointless art and art that's well respected, places that he's visited, just more stuff about his personal life. I would like him to write a nonfiction specifically about art. I don't know what it would be, but I like his insights into that, and I love people who talk about media, like within the media that I'm reading. That's one of my favorite things. There was quite a few back-to-back chapters of things that I wasn't the most interested in, but I listened to them and they were fine. So yeah, overall, enjoyed it. Would recommend, but most people have read this by now if you were going to. And that's it for this video. As always, I'm finishing it with the feeling of there were so many more books on the list that I should have read. There's books that I'm sure you're gonna have wanted me to read, and it's nice to have this plethora of recommendations to take forward. I'm sure this is gonna be the least watched of the series because not everyone is super interested in nonfiction, let alone watching someone talk about then nonfiction. But I do implore you, if you made all the way to the end and you're not somebody who picks up books to learn something from, I think you really should. There's a book out there for everyone. I really enjoyed this journey. I feel like I read a good range of things. It's not everything I thought I would when I kicked off the week, but that's it for me now, and I will see you next week for a vlog about romance. Bye!